Alrighty. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much for hopping on here to join us today. My name is Kristen Lugert, and I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Chapters and Networks with UConn Alumni, and I'm so excited to be here as we kick off our latest event in the Elevate Career Hack series surrounding an incredibly relevant topic, ageism in the workplace. Joining us today are my colleagues Samantha Morris-Avery, Jessica Alexander, and Josh Prue. Together, we bring you a slate of virtual career programming throughout the year, in addition to our annual month-long professional development series each February, Elevate. Before we get started, I'll share a few housekeeping items with you all. Closed captioning is available for those who would like to utilize this service. As you may have seen, it's been dropped in the chat by my colleague Josh. To activate it, please check your Zoom toolbar and select the CC icon below. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to utilize the chat feature to engage in discussions, network with other attendees, and share your comments. We ask that you please remember to be kind, courteous, and supportive in your comments in order to keep conversations topical. If you have any questions for our panelists, please drop those into the Q&A section on your toolbar located near the chat function. This way, our moderator will be able to field them in an organized fashion and get to as many as possible. And lastly, if you have to jump off the webinar at any point, don't worry, you won't miss out. The program is being recorded and it will be posted to our YouTube page. A link to the YouTube library, in addition to the recording, will be sent to you in a follow-up email. And with that, I'd love to introduce our moderator for today, John Brady. John is the Managing Director and Executive Performance Coach at Protem Partners. He is a keynote speaker, executive coach, and frequent media source on all matters related to corporate and career performance. He has an impressive portfolio of current and recent clients, including executives at companies like Goldman Sachs, AstraZeneca, and Apple. I'm thrilled to have him here today as our moderator of this Rockstar panel. John, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you everybody on the UConn staff, Kristen, Sam, Josh, and all the others who are behind the scenes, and to all of our Husky alums joining from wherever in the world you are hopefully having a wonderful summer. I will allow our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we will dive right in. Nora, if you would start first.
Sure. I'm Nora Duncan. I am the state director for AARP here in Connecticut. I've been doing this for 10 years this month, which seems crazy to me. I'm a class of 95 UConn Stores graduate, so I'm glad to be here today. And just a little bit about AARP, because people may not know. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan social mission organization with a membership that are mostly age 50 and up. There are about 600,000 members here in Connecticut and about 38 million nationwide. And our purpose is to empower people to choose how they live as they age. And we do that through advocacy, education, outreach, offerings, volunteerism, and more.
Nora, thank you so much. And Terry, if you would introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. It's wonderful to be here to talk about this really important topic. I am Terry Berthelot. I have an MSW, a Master's in Social Work, and a Juris Doctorate, a JD. My background is as an MSW and as an attorney. As an MSW, I ran a hospice program. That's care for people who are dying in the Mississippi Delta. After which I went to law school, and then as an attorney, I represented folks for a national not-for-profit law firm around access to health care and insurance coverage for that care. Since joining the faculty at UConn, I continue to write, do my research largely about that issue, that is access to health care and proper insurance. And I teach aging to my students, which I find wonderfully invigorating to share the love and the empathy and the caring about these issues. And students often come to UConn thinking that they want to work with children and really focusing on those issues, but getting them to recognize the importance of aging in the United States is, for me, a real joy.
Terry, this wasn't a planned thing, but having been through the process recently with aging parents, you had mentioned just to being an attorney, specifically having done elder care law. And I don't know that everybody necessarily even knows that that's a specialty or how one leans on elder care attorneys. So if you could just describe the nature of that work, because it was all new to me and it was a lot to navigate at the time.
Oh, absolutely. So it's interestingly not really taught in law school. And just like aging is not really taught in medical school, it's super important. There's a National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys. When thinking about aging and the various concerns, which might be creating a will, but also might include thinking about long-term care insurance or potentially planning around paying for long-term care. Or it can include when thinking about whether somebody should be conserved or needs a guardian. All of these issues can also mean navigating. You might have somebody who's homebound and needs care in the home, who's being told that they're not eligible for Medicare covered home health care. All of those issues, it's best to go with an attorney who is part of NALA, the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys. And they have the expertise and the sort of the beehive, the hive knowledge around all of these issues. They're a tight community across all the states, and I strongly recommend working with a member.
Thank you for mentioning that. Just having gone through it, not knowing in the beginning that it was an area of specialization, and then afterwards having been spinning our wheels for a long time, the level of help that we got navigating federal programs, getting the right assistance, even finding out about resources that we had no idea existed just locally, because as you said, everyone is so well networked in that regard. It was just a wonderful, wonderful resource once we knew how to tap it. So I know I hadn't prepped you to go there, but thank you for that. What we had said, however, Terry, was that you were going to do some foundation setting for the rest of us, talking a little bit about ageism, how you define it. The term age bias is the one that I usually use. I don't know if you see those as the same thing or different in certain ways, but just so that we're clear for everybody on our terms as we get into the substance.
Sure, thanks for that question. So ageism really was coined in the 60s as part of the civil rights movement. And when we think of ageism, it's in a sense like other isms, like sexism or racism. It's largely judging people based on stereotypes, but it also involves recognizing that there are systemic processes, there are laws, there are policies, there are our general culture that promote these stereotypes and often cause harm to people. In the case of ageism, usually to people who are older, but ageism can also hurt younger people. Ageism can also hurt people, they might be considered too young for something. So and a piece of that is recognizing that, particularly in our culture, we tend to think people should do things at various stages in their lives. And if they're not doing it at the right stage, we judge them for it. They're too old for that, they're too young for that, isn't that silly? In terms of age bias, I think it grows out of ageism. It's a consequence thereof, and it's very much a part of living in the United States.
So in some ways, it's, I guess you're saying it's more pronounced in the US than perhaps other places?
I'm not prepared to generalize there. I suspect it's elsewhere, okay. But what I know most about is ageism in the United States.
Fair enough. Nora, you had pointed this out when we were doing a prep call at one point, and there's been so much discussion over the last, I don't know, it's probably at least half a dozen years. We've been spending more time talking about different generations in the workplace. I mean, when the millennials came in as a big group, because we Gen Xers were a much smaller group, nobody really thought much about it. We were just sort of expected to adapt. But when the millennials came in, much like the boomers did, their sheer size commanded a different kind of attention. And now moving to the Gen Z population, you had mention the fact that for the first time, we've got something like 5 generations in the labor market all at the same time. So if you could just speak to that a little bit as sort of the other part of the foundation setting here, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So for the first time ever, there are actually 5 generations in the workplace. I was thinking about this today as my youngest staff member, it's her 40th birthday. My oldest staff member retired last week. She was 70. I'm hiring. The rest of us are in between. What does that look like? Who's coming down the pike? So I've been thinking a lot about this. I mean, I think I'd like to speak to kind of what people don't sort of think about the fact that age is part of diversity in a way that they should. You know, we always consider you know, gender, race, all the basics, religion, you know, sexual orientation. We go through all of that when we think about diversity. So often age is left out, and it's interesting because the strength of having a multi-generational workforce is something that could really help businesses grow. It's something that when we think about the fact that, you know, we're in this super strange hiring world that we're in now, where, you know, there's a million jobs and people aren't working and we don't know where they are. What can we do as employers and as hiring managers and as people in our offices looking to help our bosses and our colleagues grow our workforce? What does that look like? And one of the things that, you know, to put this positive spin on it is that AARP, the World Economic Forum, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development put together this platform called Growing with Age to provide employers with tools to unlock that multi-generational workforce power. It gives employers assessments that they can use to evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses of their age-specific diversity and inclusion initiatives. It offers benchmarking tools, you know, shows them case studies about how when there's, you know, a Gen Z and a boomer in the workforce together, that they can come together to create opportunity, economic opportunity, profit margin increases. And it helps organizations get support they need to build and sustain these generational workforces. And if we don't think this way, that workforce opportunity gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And I'm going to just speak about what I've been thinking about a lot lately in this hiring that I'm doing. I looked back 10 years ago at an organization, the Connecticut Nonprofit Alliance, where the HR department in AARP posted my job. That's 10 years ago, right now, okay? That there were 122 resumes posted for my job. I have had the job I'm hiring for, which is lower, but it's still very competitive. Out in the field for almost a month, I only have 23 applications. If I'm not being creative, if I'm not looking at this in a multi-generational way, if I'm not being super open-minded to all parts of the diversity spectrum, including age, I am really going to be suffering from a small pool of people who, you know, maybe that right person is in there, but it's really interesting. And I don't think a lot of employers, when you hear them on the news clips, when you hear them complaining about the workforce opportunities, I don't necessarily think they're thinking about age.
Throughout a panel or webinar like this, certainly it accelerates more toward the end, but I think most people join these things not just for the intellectual exercise and sort of enrichment of the knowledge, but also to get practical tools, tips, whatever. And the Growing with Age initiative is something that I was not aware of. So in I don't know, a 30 to 60 second, Nora, is that entirely a self-paced tool? Does it more, is it primarily something that would be used by like a DE&I team, or in other words, you could tell sort of how it's structured and how it's targeted at just a really high level?
It is self-paced, but the things like, and it would be good for a DE&I or an HR or even you know, an executive team. skill building opportunity, or at least starting there and handing it off to your HR department. But there are a lot of things in there that an individual can go look at and learn from, especially if they are someone who's in the job market, maybe who is younger and who is older and wants to showcase how they can give and be a part of a multi-generational workforce in a really positive looking forward way, right? We talk about, you know, how you put yourself out there, and generally speaking from an AARP perspective, I speak about it from an age 50 and up perspective, which, you know, I'm turning 50 next year, so this is all really becoming super relevant to me. But young people need to figure out a way to put their best foot forward and be competitive. Older people need to figure it out. And then those in the middle, who are supposed to be the perfect, generally speaking, how Americans think, right? The perfect middle management, the perfect, get ready to take your next step. I think for an individual, it's worth looking at as well, but I would definitely recommend it for E teams, C teams, HR, ODE, and I. And I will pop the link into the chat for people to take a look at.
That would be terrific. And there's some folks I know who would love to take a look at that. So I appreciate that. Terry, when we were doing some prep, however many weeks ago that was, one of the comments you had made that I honed in on at the time was you had talked about the issue of ageism being something that's changing and understudied, was the phrase you had used. What did you mean by that? And specifically, I guess, what should we be thinking about when we think about the fact that these are issues that are dynamic and understudied?
Yeah, let me start with one thought, and that is just the pervasiveness of ageism. That generally speaking, I think most people, I hope most people in the United States acknowledge that racism is bad, that sexism is bad. But ageism, there's sort of this sense that older people should step aside, that that's sort of the natural course of things, and to make room for younger people. That ageism is fairly still accepted, and that's an important concept to recognize. And that might have something to do with the research dollars. So research dollars that that study aging are so overwhelmingly about the medicalization of aging, that it's all about the things we're really scared of, you know, we're heart disease, of course, and Alzheimer's, and of course we want money to go into these things, but there's not a lot to sort of think about the social aspects, the legal aspects, the human aspects of aging. There's not much literature. There's not much historical research on aging. So the dollars are just not there. And in terms of how ageism is changing, I'm not sure I'm willing to go quite that far. I might have said that before, but aging is changing in the United States in the sense that we have this generation, the boomers, hitting it. And the generations have redefined everything. So there's every reason to believe that they will have the same impact on our aging. And hopefully that will all be good. Hopefully it might mean changes in transportation. It might mean changes in how houses are built. Today in Connecticut, for instance, all the new houses continue to be colonials, which is the worst possible sort of setup for aging. With bedrooms upstairs and not bedrooms downstairs, and without full baths downstairs, and with stairs. We're just not forward thinking. But it might be that having such a large population, it's going to be roughly 5% of our population, 20% of our population, all old at the same time, really might make some definitive change. And so that's what I'm thinking about.
I can't recall, I'm sorry, which one of you had said this in our prior conversation, but you had mentioned that it was very easy for many of us, even who may experience ageism or age bias in whatever way, to foster some of those ageist behaviors or thinking and not even realize it. What would that look like? I mean, if I were, I don't know, trying to just be more self-aware in that regard, what are those things that maybe I should be looking for, listening for in my own thought process?
I'll jump in there. How often do we make jokes about forgetting stuff? How often do we set things like, oh, I'm having a senior moment, and giggle, right? But my daughter forgets things too. She wanders around in the kitchen and she's 16. Yeah, maybe we're a little more forgetful, but the sort of willingness to make jokes about it. And also it's so baked in the sense of not talking about how old we are, and not recognizing all of the different ways that people are aging, and our ableist worries are sort of thinking that when people are impaired some way, that somehow it's their fault, that if they'd only done more exercise and eaten better when they were younger, they wouldn't have diabetes, or they might not need a cane. So there's so many ways that we should be rethinking about aging.
In my work, helping people with their careers and getting to their next job, I mean, I'm seeing these issues all the time. I mean, it's almost a daily discussion point, or at least pretty darn close to it, with varying degrees. And so many of my clients are seeing these kinds of thought tracks come up earlier and earlier. I mean, this used to be something that we just sort of assumed didn't happen until at least age 50, or certain visible triggers, changing in hair color and other such things. But it's getting to a point where, depending on which sector you're in, a lot of the folks that I work with are experiencing more of a lower level sort of unconscious bias around age, definitely by age 40, and in some cases even late 30s, because it's easy to keep churning out jobs for people who have that, they're definitely past that entry level stage, but not necessarily those middle manager, senior executive level type jobs. And it's like everyone's looking for somebody with that 5 to 7 years of experience, maybe 10, and then all of a sudden, they don't really know what to do. They sort of assume that means someone that many years out of formal education, perhaps, or something beyond that level of experience, or time accrued in a particular discipline or domain or whatever. And I am, to your point, usually suggesting it's very easy for us to engage in self-deprecating humor, and we tend to think of humor as being disarming, but we actually end up fostering more of the problem and drawing more attention to it. We're sort of thinking that we're calling out the elephant in the room, right? Referring, if I were to say something about, I don't know, my gray hair, my dad bod, whatever, right? And like you said, Terry, chuckle, but really I'm kind of giving more permission for it. And I'm working against myself, drawing more attention to the thing that is not necessarily what I want people to be focused on, which is the substance of, my candidacy or whatever. So I'm usually telling my clients as much as possible to try and catch those behaviors in themselves.
Yeah. And I don't want to monopolize this time, but just to echo what you said, most complaints about ageism in the workplace are made by people in their 50s. And women are, based on the data, more impacted than men. Men, of course, are impacted, but a woman in her 50s, in terms of reports to the EEOC, is the most likely to experience ageism in the workplace.
That's actually a perfect segue. Nora, about, I don't know, I want to say it was pre-pandemic, so I don't know, maybe it was like 4 years ago. AARP had put out a report or a study or something of that in that space, that so that something like 2/3 of workers, 2/3 over the age of 45. So really mid-career. I mean, they're truly at like the midpoint, they've still got a lot of time to go. 2/3 of workers over 45 said that they had experienced age discrimination in some way. You probably remember that particular report better than I do, but were there, in what places are people seeing it? In what ways are they seeing it in the research and the advocacy work that AARP is doing, whether you want to talk about the national level or the state level?
Well, I can do both. I'd like to say it's gotten better, but it's gotten worse, and the pandemic has had an impact. In 2021, in May, so just over a year ago, we did some age-related research on this topic, and in that 45 and up, job seekers and people who are working, older workers' perceptions of age discrimination were at rates much higher than in the past, and the data from that research showed that 78% of older workers, and I'm saying 45 and up now, say they have seen or experienced age discrimination in the workplace, and that's the highest level we've seen since we began tracking that question in 2003. So in 2018, which probably is what you're looking at, it was 61%. So we're talking 78% compared to 61%. And in that same survey, we asked how many people thought that that laws should combat age discrimination, that should be more seriously taken issue by elected officials, and 96% thought that was the case, that we should be working harder to combat age discrimination. The fighting it issue, which is, and where we're seeing it, I think we're seeing it everywhere. I see in the comments here, we're talking about the IT industry, and Sally, I will get to your concern that you can't find the careers page. I'll make sure my job, the one I have, and the general page is posted. It's everywhere. It's in depth. Don't want to use pandemic and endemic and endemic and all those words that we use now all the time, but it's constant. And we have taken on ways to fight it, both from an educational aspect and from a legal aspect here in Connecticut and nationwide. I'm proud to say that, and I popped in a link that says disrupt aging. When we talk about like where this stuff is learned and how we fight it, and the joking, and it's, an 18-year-old can be discriminated against in the same way an 80-year-old can be, if you're talking about age as, I have too little experience or too much. Here in Connecticut, we developed something called Disrupt Aging Classroom, which has gone nationwide. I'm really proud of my staff and my volunteers for doing that. But what it is we go into all sorts of different disciplines. So into a social work class, into an architecture class, into a engineering class, to what Terry talking about, how we develop housing stock, our transportation concerns. These are all advocacy issues we work on in Connecticut all the time. I'm drowning in them, in fact. But we go in at a level of having trained volunteers bring to the classroom a structured curriculum that addresses the issues of ageism and helps students identify, regardless of what they're doing for their academic career, where they turns out they're being biased or having their own biases or being discriminated against, and how, when they realize that, and they realize that there is actually I'll just put it this most simple way possible, dollars to be made, opportunities to explore when you think about aging differently, and I can talk about that a little bit more, that your world opens up to you. And when that happens, your mindset opens up to you, right? So if you're training an architect, we don't need to train him, this is a very simplified version, right? But just to build colonials. Where is the business aspect of what I can do with my career to be different, to serve my community, and to still achieve and succeed? And so when you look at the economic opportunities associated with, we call it the longevity economy, then we start to think about things differently. And we have folks who have actually changed career paths as a result of this classroom. It's tested, it's researched over the course of months with before and after surveys, but it's really interesting, and anybody can volunteer to do that. You'll see the Disrupt Aging Classroom, as well as other things around Disrupt Aging. It addresses everything. And our CEO wrote a book, and it kind of started when she kicked it off with, Why are we sending people birthday cards that when they turn 50 are associated with death and demise, right? That's not a joke, and it's not true. I have potentially another 25 years or more of work ahead of me, not to mention that much plus more of life ahead of me. We need to be talking about how this is positive, incorporated. We need to plan for it as a society, because if we don't, we are going to face a major economic problem. And we need to realize that this country is going to be older than it is younger in about 20 years. And what does that look like for our systems, for our structures, for our healthcare system, for our family healthcare system? I mean, we have caregivers who are providing the bulk of care in this country. So, I mean, there's a lot to that, but I will say that that longevity economy and this is being looked at. I mean, we're at Davos in Switzerland with, you know, all these people from around the world talking about this on a regular basis. And I will just give you this stat. So discrimination against workers over age 50 cost the US economy $850 billion in 2018. So we're talking pre-pandemic. Raising employment levels of workers over age 50 to match countries with the highest participation of 50 plus workers would increase the GDP across all OECD countries by $10.3 trillion, which would offset the economic loss of older workers' employment levels if we were to remain stagnant. So, I mean, we've got to think about things differently. We have no choice. I mean, it's the right thing to do, but it's also the necessary.
Yeah, but it's not easy to change people's thinking at the same time, or to even change our own. Quick sidebar: there's been some activity in the chat space that's visible to everybody. So if you haven't been looking there, I'm not so much directing this at the panelists, but the attendees. Sometimes it's easy to just focus on the talking heads, but there's some good engagement here that I don't normally see. So if you haven't taken note, you may want to just scroll through some of the things that are in there, and but we'll keep going. Nora, some of the things that you said, also, it's almost like we scripted all of it, which we did not. But there was a Harvard Business Review article, I don't know, a couple of years ago, maybe. It wasn't really that long ago, that cited a couple of things that were interesting, things I certainly didn't know. In one area of the article, it cited some research from the Stanford Center on longevity, and as opposed to what it was, the basic synopsis of it was that, counter to the stereotypes and some of the things that we've been talking about, that most workers over the age of 45 or 50 have been healthier, generally demonstrate a stronger work ethic, were generally more loyal to their employers, and were much more likely to be satisfied at work or overall engaged. And when I think about the amount of time we've spent in professional circles talking about employee engagement, I mean, it was true certainly pre-pandemic, even more so during. Fascinating that you have this group of people that we're sort of assuming is, you know, tired and checked out and maybe just not as plugged into what's going on. And the data supports it's 180-degree opposite, and that's pretty rare to be quite that that starkly different. The same article cited some work that came out of the London Business School and stated that in some research, workers in the UK who were under the age of 45 were more likely to report feeling exhausted, 43%, compared to 35% of those over the age of 45, and that those over the age of 60 were the least likely to feel exhausted by their work, which I thought was very interesting. Again, not the numbers I would have expected out of really any advanced economy. And I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on that, Terry, in particular, because you study these things.
Yeah, I guess first I want to just follow up on something Nora said in terms of needing stronger laws. People should note that the Age Discrimination in Employment Act is different than other laws that came out of the civil rights movement. So when we think about laws that prohibit racism and sexism in the workplace, that those laws permit compensatory and punitive damages against the employers. and the Age Discrimination in Employment Act does not. So when you bring a suit, when you make a complaint, what happens is the EEOC brings the lawsuit, and the punishment is basically will be that the organization will have to pay fines, which is different than a case where you could have punitive or compensatory damages where the individual actually gets reimbursed, gets damages for the harm caused. So recognizing those differences and understanding just how ageism is sort of a step, well, that's a terrible analogy. It's sort of like is not really respected in terms of the damage that's being done by it. So having stronger laws would certainly be helpful. John, if you'd be kind enough to remind me of the question you actually asked me.
No, after citing the research from that HBR article out of both Stanford and the London Business School, it was just the exact 180-degree opposite truth of the stereotype, which is rare. I mean, we find those things. We usually assume that stereotypes have coming from a partial kernel of truth and then just really distorted in whatever way. But in this case, it just seemed very shocking to me how different it was. And I wasn't sure as a researcher if there were things that you wanted to point out from that.
Well, sort of happiness at all stages of our lives comes from meaningful engagement. Wherever we are in terms of our lifespan, whether we're young adults or whether we're older adults. So working can be a wonderful place for ongoing meaningful engagement. And when we think of productivity, that's a way of being productive, but also recognizing that people who have left the workplace, sometimes because they need to take care of their families, and sometimes because they've decided to retire, can often continue to be meaningfully productive through volunteer work or the work they're doing for their family, or is often the case with women, the actual caregiving, because we don't have our long-term care plan in the United States is not to have one. So what is often happening, usually to people, women in their 50s, is that they're trying to keep this meaningful job, but they're also taking care of loved ones, which might include their children as well. So they're juggling all of these things. But to your point, in terms of why it's 180 degrees, when we have good work, we're happy. Wherever we are. So it makes sense that employees who are in their 60s, who are doing work that matters to them, are all in.
John, can I jump in
Sure.
there on something? I think it's interesting that, when you talk about the statistics you were reading off, and if you have good work, you're all in. We spend a lot of time, especially here in Connecticut, but focusing on reskilling and offering people opportunities at age 50 plus to try something different. So for instance, we support scholarships it's a UConn public policy program actually called Encore Connecticut, where the whole goal of that program is to take people from the for-profit, sometimes executive, middle management world, and go through a curriculum and an immersion program into the nonprofit sector. Because maybe I'm just done doing what I've been doing for 25 or 30 years, but I'm not done, right? So maybe I was, a big wig in the insurance industry, but now I'm really interested in helping women with domestic abuse issues recover and be safe. Okay, come pursue that. Scholarships to help do that. We've got two universities in Connecticut that offer scholarship discounts. They're not the state's not that easy to work with, sorry, UConn. But it's Goodwin University and Albertus Magnus. So you can re-career into anything from manufacturing, which we also have scholarships for at the community college level, because it's a growing and needed industry where you can walk in the door, and if you can work an iPad for the most part and do some math, you can completely re-career and at a good salary and move up the ladder quickly. So we really find that important, and AARP offers some things nationally too, just on making sure your skills stay relevant. Some of them are free, some of them are discounted, but things like, basic Microsoft Office suite. We have courses for free for people to get certificates, because that's so much of what it is to be able to stay competitive, to stay relevant, to stay happy, to stay engaged. And we have found through our research that older workers are particularly interested in continuing education and skill building, especially when their employer is making it part of their offerings, right? So at AARP, we have tuition reimbursement, right? There's some catches. You can't just get your degree and leave that somebody paid for, right? But I mean, these are the kind of things that good companies can do to help people. And it doesn't have to be as big as tuition reimbursement, but it can be personal development, professional development. Stay engaged really matters to older workers.
This isn't by any means an exhaustive list, but among the things that I usually recommend to clients, ideally in a proactive way, sort of getting out ahead of it before these issues are more likely to come up. But even once they do, certifications or any kind of continuing and ongoing education, for a couple of reasons. There's the learning for the learning's sake, obviously, and sometimes there are different certifications and whatnot, but there's also value, whether it's on a resume or a LinkedIn profile, in just people seeing you always learning and growing at any stage of life, at any stage of career. That recency effect, the fact that you're still getting new skills and trying new things, including things that are entirely self-paced and don't come with a formal sort of credential of some kind. A lot of the online courses that are offered on LinkedIn Learning or Coursera, a lot of the sort of open stuff that's out there, by just getting that social proof and that date and time stamping of all of it in whatever way, the workshops that and conferences, virtual or otherwise, that you attend, speaking engagements, absolutely. If you're doing any sort of contributing to an article, even if it's as an editor as opposed to doing the writing, and making sure that stuff is appearing in the stuff that you're putting out there, it shows that you're still evolving and growing. And it particularly the unconscious bias aspects of this, which can creep in really, really early. All that stuff kind of helps neutralize where the negative perceptions that people often associate with this. And in a similar vein, I usually recommend that folks change sometimes their own thinking. We start adopting these thought processes. I mean, some of that self-deprecating humor that I was asking about or referencing earlier, it's coming from somewhere inside, I think, a lot of the time, and we can give things voice and make them worse. And it's important to remember that your age can also be a tremendous asset in ways that are pretty easy to point out. Most folks that have worked longer, they have a bigger network. They've met more people. It's got a lot more depth to it. There are different connections and introductions and resources that you just naturally have access to by picking up a phone or your digital device of choice and reaching out to somebody that you worked with at whatever point that, folks at a different point in their career, they just don't have yet and haven't had an opportunity to develop just yet. Usually folks who are mid-career and certainly later career, they know themselves pretty well. They know what their passions are, and passion gets perceived as being high energy, even if you don't outwardly display what would typically be seen as high energy or intensity. Just that level of focus and passion, people interpret it as energy. And since a lack of or lower energy is one of the incorrect and negative views, it's one of those things that you can allow to be seen and be visible in your interviewing, in your discourse, and your networking, and in ways that kind of mute and mitigate some of this stuff before it starts to happen. I mean, the list is long, but those are just a couple of things that come to mind. One of the questions that has been waiting for a little bit in the category of the, yeah, we know it's bad, but like, what do we actually do? And as an individual, what if you see someone acting in a fashion that is ageist, how do you, or what do you do in a situation like that that is appropriate and that also doesn't make matters worse? And I'll just put that out to both of you.
Well, I mean, it's a tough one. You know, one thing I've said, I have to use this legislatively a lot of times, I guess, right? Because people say things they don't sort of recognize that they're saying. But, you know, age is the one thing we all have in common, unless very unfortunately we don't, right? So it's like when people get the AARP mailer and I'm like, no, that really was for you. We started about 48 and you know, you are approaching actual age, but the alternative is terrible. But we do all have this in common. So why is it the one thing that we're so insensitive to, right? And so I just don't think people think of it that way. And I had recently a conversation where I know somebody has a significant amount of value in one of their older colleagues, but they made kind of an assumption that maybe somebody wasn't going to be able to be qualified for or interested in something because they were too old. And I was like, well, what about, you know, we'll just say Pete. And they were like, oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. Pete would love this. So I'm like, so why wouldn't this person love this? But it is a commonality. And I mean, almost everybody has somebody older that they love and respect, and making those identifications is important. And I think for someone super young in our Disrupt Aging classroom, one of the activities does get most of them to recognize that age discrimination doesn't feel good, and that they have been discriminated against because, yeah, oh, you're too young, you don't have enough experience, you know, come back in 5 years, and you feel like you're being denied opportunity based on something that you really don't have control of, which is your age, right? And so it is easy to help people identify that way when they're much younger as well. It's probably the middle of the road people my age that have sometimes the hardest time with it.
And I guess I'd follow up with knowing the facts, like John, when you were talking about the piece in the research about the aging population in the journal. If you could say something like, yeah, I used to think like that, but I just read this piece where it talked about older workers and this, that, or the other thing could be helpful. I mean, that really only works when it's not you who's the target. But if you're just sort of seeing it in your workplace in general, to bring the facts to light as much as possible, I think can be super helpful. And also just knowing everything you can. I mean, knowing that that it's common sort of political sort of stuff to pit the different generations against each other, and to make it sound like it's a zero-sum game. So, you know, if we have older people who are collecting Social Security and have Medicare insurance, that's necessarily hurting younger people, rather than recognizing things like, it's because my mom had Medicare and could get treatment for her cancer that I didn't have to spend all my money, and thus I have some money saved so my daughter can go to college. To recognize that these programs are intergenerational. And maybe you're on the school board in your local community or the town council. When you're thinking about building buildings, thinking about making them intergenerational spaces where we need to stop separating everybody, so that we throughout our lives recognize the value of each other, so that we don't have a senior center and a daycare center and a school, that these spaces are places where there might be, I don't know, a school you can imagine where the kids are there till 3, but in the evening there might be a intergenerational dance. So we all need to get out of these boxes.
You know, and we always talk about intergenerational learning, and I think a lot of folks just feel like that's kind of happy talk as opposed to something that really happens. But you know, every now and again people surprise you, and there's a summer youth program that I've been on the staff for and volunteered at for years, for decades now. And it's funny, here I am with a major milestone birthday just months away, and it's certainly been weighing on me, not in a lot of negative ways, but more as this is an inflection point, an opportunity to just, I don't know, think about whatever the next chapter is. But it is kind of heavy. And one of the students at this program, 17 years old, he was talking about his stage of life, not mine, but I thought it was such a great quote. He was at the end of the week and he was reflecting, and he said, you know, getting older is scary, but I guess it's going to happen anyway. But growing older, that's pretty cool. I thought that was such a profound statement from a 17-year-old. Getting older is kind of scary, but it's going to happen anyway. But growing older, that's pretty cool. So, you know, intergenerational learning really happens. I'm here to tell you. I thought that was great. There are a lot of questions that have been coming in that are, again, more of the, every situation is really different. It's so hard to answer a lot of specifics when there are things related to job or job seeking or career without a whole lot more context. But generally speaking, when a lot of the themes, they still seem to hit on the same thing, and it's the how do I ellipsis, and what's after the ellipsis is some kind of you know, get past this or help others get past it so that I'm not paying the price for it or getting stuck. And in addition to some of the things that I've mentioned, again, it sort of depends on people's situation, but when people are interviewing and they're talking to folks who are going to be their boss, who are younger than they are, that can be the first time that happens. That can seem, I think, it can be very jarring, you know, to realize you're interviewing with someone who's 10, 15, maybe 20 years, even your junior. And one of the things I usually tell my clients to do is ask more questions than answers. That's generally more comfortable for people, and it works against this idea that there's somebody threatening who knows more or who could treat them like, you know, they know more than the person in charge. And first of all, you learn a lot more information that way, but also, again, it just sort of naturally works against some of those belief systems. One of the articles that I was reading, I think it was the HBR article, the Harvard Business Review article, phrased this as, you know, going into job seeking conversations or even existing job conversations with superiors with a consulting mindset or a consulting approach. Most people appreciate that more at any stage of life and even with peers at any situation. But I think there's a point where we just get so frustrated by all of it. We've seen it all before that we kind of just want to cut to the quick. But it's funny, when people get used to you asking them questions, they start to see the age as an asset that they actually want to have around, as opposed to something that they're concerned about. Are there other things that I haven't brought up, again, in the sort of category of doing, that's sort of actionable, like, oh, things that I should be thinking about if I'm finding myself on the wrong end of this? I mean, you know, outside of like the big stuff, I mean, filing lawsuits and so forth. I mean, sometimes in those cases, even when you win, you lose because it takes a really long time and there are costs that aren't monetary that are involved in something like that. And it's very, very hard to prove in a lot of these cases. But, you know, more in the sort of day-to-day, you know, managing all of this. You know, for example, if somebody asks an inappropriate question, age-related question in an interview, I usually tell people to reframe it somehow and just say, tell me a little bit more about, you know, what it is that you're either concerned about or what I could illuminate more about, you know, my background or whatever. I sort of encourage people to, you know, vent about it and kind of flip out later, but in the moment, just, you know, not lose the game face and instead just put it back on them, because they're almost immediately going to realize that intentionally or not, they kind of overstep. But are there other things that maybe we haven't hit on? Because I'm mindful of the time here. We're getting near the top of the hour.
Yeah, I mean, I just popped into the chat some free resources from AARP for, you know, tools, advice, and resources for the 50 plus in job seeking. I kind of am of the mindset that what, like you said, to reframe questions, right? But practicing first and reading up first before you go into the interviews and before you start even the job seeking process, or even if you're going for you know, a promotion or something. Brenda had mentioned in the chat about how she handles her resume. There are a lot of ways to be proactive about how you present yourself and how you react. And there are a lot of tips there, and they're specifically generated for the age 50 and up. And so I would just say homework, practice, so that you're prepared when you go in. And I really like, John, that have more questions than you know, for people than you might ordinarily, because, you know, curiosity, interest, showing that you did your research really helps. And that is a deficit for a lot of people. So make yourself stand out so that you don't have that deficit.
Yeah, almost in a defensive way. It's like we want to prove ourselves that much more, which means we double down on the strategy that actually hurts more in terms of fostering the thinking that we don't want, or drawing attention to the very thing that we don't want to. I mean, the self-deprecating humor that we started with and talked about, but really, one of the ways I tell a lot of my clients who are just beginning to maybe experience some of this, especially in like the tech sector and so forth, where it can often happen very, very early, is, if you don't want age to be the focus, don't make it your focus, which is easier said than done, understand, but we give ourselves away a lot, and that insecurity, it makes it worse in so many ways. Terry, were you about to jump in with something? I'm sorry.
I wasn't. I was just thinking how much I'm learning from the both of you on this particular front. So those are all, I think, terrific recommendations.
Likewise. One of the other questions, and there are more than obviously we'll be able to get to, but is ageism presenting itself more because of the virtual nature of the workplace? A lot of that is related to the pandemic, but not all of it. This was shifting well before. It accelerated absolutely because of COVID. But are you finding that people are experiencing ageism or age bias more with any of the dynamics of the virtual workplace? The way that we are visible and the ways we are less visible in a virtual workplace. And then I'm mindful of the time, we'll start wrapping up. But
I mean, I think it's leveled off, the virtual workplace discrimination of early 2020. I think people have had a lot of practice. There are gads of information about the percentage of people age 70 and up who have embraced technology and come online in a way that they're not even in the workforce necessarily anymore. We're talking 85, 90 years old, people who realize I have to do this now. Maybe I was sitting back, but the time to practice, I think, has really been there. What I is more concerning to me, which I'm not fully sure has worn off, is this: COVID is dangerous to people who are older. Therefore, we don't want to bring older people in because they're more at risk, or I'm more at risk of losing them if the pandemic resurges, right? Mm. And you could, in the beginning of the pandemic, like in the first month or two, there was so much about like, don't worry, it's really only hurting old people.
Yeah, it was really, really focused on.
So, which is just not true. And we did a lot of work in that space. It was a very difficult time, actually, for us to sort of policy-wise to talk about age while saying, it's important that we get people vaccinated who are older first, but it's also important that we don't, discriminate against people in the same vein. But I do think that I do feel pretty good about the technology aspect of things.
Terry, was there anything on that dimension you wanted to add before we started moving to
the only Nora's point. It was terrible in the early days of COVID how comfortable people were with the idea that it was okay that it was taking older people and that somehow the older people were more vulnerable, and not recognizing again that we're all breathing the same air, and that younger people getting sick were going to interact with their own parents and their grandparents, and but yeah, the key piece being here that somehow, well, they're going to die soon anyway, that was okay, was heartbreaking.
There were a lot of things heartbreaking about that period, and it's not entirely over, but hopefully the worst of it certainly is. It is so difficult. One of the great things about UConn is that we take on these huge topics, but it's really, really hard to figure out how to encapsulate all of this in a platform and a medium like this. But I don't know, I think you both did pretty darn well, so thank you for everything. And before I turn it back over to the staff, just because I don't have permission to share his name, unfortunately, but I still think that for a 17-year-old, this was great. Getting older is scary, but I guess it's going to happen anyway. But growing older, that's pretty cool. So right he is. Kristen, I'm going to let you do whatever announcements you have, wrap up, and if there are any things for the good of the order or the panelists that I didn't get to, I'm sure you can jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I could end it any better than on that quote again, but I'll sure try. Thank you all again so much for joining us today and spending your lunch hour. And a special huge thank you to all of our panelists for making this event possible. This topic really is as timely as ever, I feel, and it's very prevalent in a lot of different ways. So we were really happy to bring you all together to explore this phenomenon of ageism. I would like to say keep an eye out for the next installment of our Elevate Career Hack series. It's coming in September, and it will cover the topic of unconscious bias, which is a nice transition from this program into that one. And keep an eye out post-event, either later today or tomorrow, for a survey and the recording to this session, so that you can watch it back and see anything you may have missed. But thank you all so much again for your time. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.